to the first initiative which we have coined Insights from Ideas Consulting Group. Before I introduce the speakers, it's my duty to say a few things about our organization, the reason why we have assembled together, and of course, what we expect from this discussion. We have called it Experts Discuss. Why? I think it has been a few weeks now when the new laws have been proposed by the government for the agricultural industry, and there has been a lot of discussion, debate, both for and against the laws. We are not here for any political purpose. We are here with our expertise and experience to decipher the laws and what impact it could have on four large players: farmers, consumers, people like us who buy vegetables, the business, which is a part of the industry, and of course, government, both at the center and the state. The Ideas Consulting Group, our endeavor over the last nearly 17 years has been how can we help businesses to grow profitably. We are essentially a team of experienced professionals who have had the good fortune of having studied in very premier institutes like IIT, IIM, as well as Stanford University. We have worked in various organizations, various industries in India and abroad, and have come together to collectively share our experiences for businesses and help them grow. This initiative called Insights is a monthly feature which we are beginning in the first month of 2021, where we intend to make complex subjects as simple as possible by engaging the experts who are available with us to discuss these topics. Today, we are fortunate to have two gentlemen, very distinguished. Let me first introduce the gentleman who is more experienced in life first, and then I will come to the second person who is as experienced but much younger to all of us. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Shyam Vember. Shyam is an alumnus of NIT and IIM. He has a very distinguished career in the corporate world, where he has worked with organizations like Hindustan Unilever, Monsanto, which is a big name in agrochemicals in India, in Far East, in USA, and many such other continents. And finally, when he decided that enough is enough, he was heading the agribusiness for a very prestigious and reputed organization in India, the Mahindras. Shyam has extensive experience in the agricultural industry in variety of roles, and he has also got a lot of experience, especially with Mahindra, on the African subcontinent, and I have requested him to bring in some of his experience there and what are the lessons and learnings that we can get from there. Shyam currently is a certified executive coach, and for the interest of the audience in this discussion, he is currently mentoring several startups in the agri-tech space. And there are some interesting stories which he can perhaps share with us. He will be joined in this discussion by Subroto Rana. Subroto is a IIT alumnus, and he has studied behavioral economics at Stanford University, where he was fortunate to have one of his teachers, Dr. Richard Thaler, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2017 for his exemplary work on economics. Subroto has worked for the World Bank throughout his corporate career, and he has worked for the bank in agriculture as one of the focus industries in variety of places in Asia, Africa, and of course, he was based in US for a long period of time. He brings in a very interesting dimension to the discussion. Behavioral economics, as we all know, has certain implications which is beyond economics. It is about behavior. I know for sure he has worked while in the bank on a project where he has quantifiably assessed the business excellence and creditworthiness for farmers in Africa, for corporate organizations who are involved in farming as or agriculture in the industry to support farmers to grow their business. We would like to talk about 4 or 5 broad issues which we are going to discuss today. We all know agriculture is a big employment industry for us. 60% nearly of the population is in agricultural pursuit. And I think if I know my numbers correctly, around 17% of the GDP belongs to agriculture. And I'm sure all of us have seen during this pandemic and lockdown, everybody was hoping that the monsoon doesn't betray us in 2020 so that the agricultural sector is not badly impacted, and that could help India's resilience to sort of overcome this pandemic. Between Shyam and Subroto and together, they will be throwing their or discussing and sharing their point of view on the following. First, what is the existing law and what is the new law? What are the essential differences? And what are the impact of these laws on farmers, us as consumers, business, and the government? Before I hand over to Subroto to start the proceedings, I am sure all of us will agree that no law, no decision can be having only one side of the coin. Merits and demerits of any decision, any judgment, any law cannot be avoided because they are two sides of the same coin. I think it's important for us to keep this perspective in mind and listening to Subroto and Shyam. Let me start by requesting Subroto to decipher the laws as they exist and the way they are proposed to be for the benefit of all of us. By the way, we are live on Facebook. We are recording the entire conversation, and subsequently we will be uploading the entire recording on YouTube. So any of your friends, relatives, colleagues who may have missed the session today and is interested in the topic, you're most welcome to share the details with them so that they can listen to them. Subroto, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be part of this initiative of ideas, and I'm personally honored to be featured in their very first session in this particular endeavor. Yeah, I think because of the newspaper and television and all, I mean, most of us, if not everyone, is now aware of what is happening in this particular farm laws. We probably may not be able to understand the fuller extent of that, but we all know what is happening because of all this happening around us. I would take a couple of minutes to really understand that what is these three laws and what exactly the major provisions of these three laws. Before I start, I would really like to stress the fact that the reform in agriculture sector was long due. Many governments in the past have tried, bits and pieces here and there. But I think probably this is the first time a comprehensive attempt has been there on behalf of Government of India to really institute a reform in the agriculture sector. Now, as Deepak mentioned, any reform, wherever you do, irrespective of sector, reform is like something like a bigger deal. I mean, it's not going to really, satisfy or make everybody happy. But then the question comes, why then we do reform? Things are going on, every system has its own problems, every system has its advantage and disadvantage. But we generally do reform primarily looking at that particular industry sector. Is there any potential? Is there any barrier to the growth? If there is a barrier to the growth, then obviously we need to really relax, relook at it. And second is that, is it necessary to do something, the changes for a larger society goal, for larger, making a more wide society. Now, on the both count, agriculture reform is very much necessary. And needless to say, India being a superpower, an emerging superpower, we are, in another 10 years time from now, we'll be the third largest economy. So a sector like agriculture cannot be left aside. We really have to look into that. Now, essentially the first law, what is coming out of the three law is called Farmer Produce Trade and Commerce Act. So now is an act. It started as a ordinance, and now Parliament has actually passed it as an act. Now, this act actually talks about that farmers now can trade, whatever produce they are having to anywhere they like. Production, collection, aggregation, whatever they like to do, they can do. They can do their entire trading and commerce platforms and whatever the way they like. This law also prohibits state governments primarily. But as you know, the agriculture is states joint list. So it's both the state government in the federal structure like us, and the central government has a say on agriculture. So, but this law actually prohibits state government to enforce levy in the form of market fee. They cannot really put a levy on any transactions farmers are making. Now, obviously, outside that, trade areas, like, the government already had a mechanism called APMC. So the law before was that any trade of agriculture produce has to go to APMC. Now, this particular law talks about that, okay, they are not, striking down APMC, but what they're telling them, farmer has, or the producers in a broader scale, has that option or the freedom to choose. If farmer likes, they can go to APMC and sell the way they're doing it. And if they like, they can do anywhere. In fact, precursor to this change, government actually strengthened something called eNAM. It is Electronic National Agriculture Marketing, where actually farmers can do e-commerce facilities available in the farmers. And eNAM is currently doing quite well. Obviously, there's a lot of things still needs to be done, but because now that facilities are available, so farmers have an option to really do that. Now, what are the another important parameter of this particular law, that how it is going to really affect? First of all, farmers now has that option to go to any market. That means they also have control, some control of the price. So whatever price they like, wherever they'll get a better price, is ideally speaking, he or she can go and sell it there. One of the other things about this law we have to look into is that it can reduce what we call mandi cartelization. Mandis, which is APMC, commonly known as mandis in our country. We all know over a period of time, there's a cartel around that mandi. And there's a lot of vested interest around it. So this law actually talks about that. Barring few states, most of the places, this is a common concern to the producer. That mandis are actually giving the cartel. As a simple producer, it's very difficult for me to operate beyond that. Now, obviously, when you have this kind of law, so there is also certain concern. And I will also come later on and what the concern there. When we first talk about what is this law. And the second one is called Farmer Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act. Mostly talking about empowerment and protection. This is the law which gives a comprehensive framework of what we call contract farming. Now, it's a very contentious issue in India for a long time. Like how the contract farming will work, what will be the legal framework, and how to. So this law actually tried to put that legal framework in place, where farmers can actually enter into a pre-arranged contract with the buyers, including the price. They can actually decide on the price. This law also defines certain amount of dispute resolution, because that's a major a stumbling block in contract farming, not only just in India, in various places. Now, so needless to say, because if contract farming in a true sense coming in, and the pricing and everything has been determined before, much before the actual produce is delivered, it has certain advantage. Obviously, this early locking of produce and this will take place, working capital loan that will come towards an advance, and all these things will actually go to and it's a kind of win-win for both the farmers as well as the reward or organizations and companies who are actually going to utilize it. Third, which is actually very landmark, is called Essential Commodities Amendment Act. Now, essential commodity is a very interesting act in India, and and it is very heavily on the social agenda. As you all know, that Essential Commodity Act enables government to really have a control on commodities. And this list of commodities, depends on government looking at the considerations. Like say, for example, if you all know this, when the COVID comes in, now the sanitizer, mask, and everything, these are now essential. Which means you, as a trader or as a business person, you cannot hold, these commodities, particularly, create a kind of an artificial, there are, you know, short supply in the market. You can really take advantage of all this. So that is what essential commodity all about. The origin of this essential commodity actually comes from the fundamental fact is that food being so fundamental and sovereign, any artificial crisis around that will hit that community at large. So it's a government's prerogative to really look into that. No, you cannot do that. So you might have seen that whenever there's a price rise, and one of the greatest example is the onion, that or in the time of crisis, the government actually enforces this act and that allows government to really act against hoarding, acts against some kind of artificial challenges. Now this amendment act actually now take that the cap. There's no cap in it. So there is no so-called ceiling or that by which you cannot really store or hold. So all the food stuff which was under essential that has been taken. That is cereal, pulses, potatoes, onions, and maybe edible oils, that. But there's a caveat. Caveat is that in extraordinary circumstance, can be natural calamity, war, whatever. Government can impose their power and tell the market to behave that okay, this is the way to do it. Now, the Amendment Act also now gives the there is no stock limit for the traders or the processors. So it was a stock limit in the beginning, when the act was there. So new amendment is actually giving that. Now, obviously, there is a concern about that. But okay, what will happen? Particularly, what will happen to when you look at this large number of poor people still in the country and still prevalent. So what will happen to all this? Now, so obviously that issue we will discuss sometimes during the course of the time. But the one good thing will happen because of that, because people actually boost a lot of export. And I was talking to a couple of days with Deepak around. This is a very common phenomena, and particularly in the export system. India is never been considered as a very reliable partner because you start an export system, and immediately, what happens is, a government put a restriction, so you cannot really sell produce outside. And it has some other advantages as well because it will also push domestic processing industry, because many a times processing industry is facing this kind of challenge in terms of not having enough raw material to run this. So I will, so this is a kind of context, where these current laws are and what is the kind of a change that happened so far. I will, now request Sam to come and, put some introduction into it, and then I will, we'll talk more about it. That in terms of implication, even we would really like to take all of you to a little bit larger context of Indian. What is Indian agriculture? What are the kind of current challenges? So I mean, just to put a perspective around this, so that it will help all of you along with us to understand the information.
Right. Subrata, thank you. And I would wait to hear from you what are the negative sides of the new laws. I think a lot of people would like to hear that. But
Right.
before that, let me look at Sham. Sham, both incidentally, Sham and Subrata bring in a lot of global experience to this discussion. And I'm sure they will dig deep into those experience to bring their perspective. And if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box with your name, and we'll take as many as we can towards the end of the meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks. That was a wonderful exposition of the laws, and the changes that have been introduced. So let me first talk about no broadly the changes there. Now, let me just step back and talk specifically about two of these laws, right, and how they're going to impact the farmers. I think if you look at the backdrop of what's been happening with the farmer agitation, largely led in Punjab and Haryana, there seems to be a polarization across two sets of views, which each side sees it in black and white. So there's one side, which is the farmers' side, and those who, for reasons of an economic ideology, support the farmers, who seem to feel that these are terrible laws which must be completely done away with. And there's the other side, which are supporters of the law, who say, look, these laws are absolutely brilliant in every sense of the word. Nothing wrong can go in. This is absolutely good. Nothing even remotely negative can be attributed if they sort of implement these laws. I think, realistically speaking, looking at these laws in such black and white terms is not really being either practical or even intellectually honest. And I'm using a strong word here, I know that. So let me just take, the one law that's been amended, and the one that's causing the greatest amount of anxiety among the farmers, which is the abolishing the APMC restrictions and allowing farmers to sell freely across state lines and not just to licensed traders in their designated mandis. In theory, it is good because in theory, you can say that an APMC act in a particular state restricts the freedom of operation degrees of freedom that the farmers have. They force them to sell only in the mandis that are next to them, and therefore they can't ship their products across state lines and so on, right? So in theory, liberating a farmer to be able to sell wherever he or she wants to is a good step. However, and I'm in favor of it, by the way. I'm all in favor of abolishing these restrictions. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that but I think the question I think Deepak was wanting to know is how is it going to impact the farmers, small, medium, and large? So I'm saying the answer is a bit nuanced. I think in the medium to long term, the impact on the farmers is going to be very good. The impact on the Indian agricultural economy is going to be very good in terms of impact on Indian agricultural value chain in terms of efficiencies and so on and so forth. So everybody benefit, but it's going to take time for these benefits to roll through the system. Now, let's understand one thing: the background to what does the APMC system do today, right? And I'm deliberately talking about APMC. I'm not touching the minimum support price regime, which the government has said is not being discontinued. So it's unnecessarily got caught up in a whole lot of controversy. The MSP regime will stay. It's not going away, right? But let's look at the APMC restrictions. Now, the reality is the farmer universe is fragmented, right? And aggregation of supply from such a fragmented producer base, hundreds of million or 100 million farmers or 80 million farmers growing paddy and wheat, how do you procure from them? So aggregating supply from a fragmented producer base is a huge challenge, right? And since the APMCs have been there for the last 40, 50 years, they have played the roles of aggregation and have become over time very efficient with it, right? They do aggregation role, they do a price discovery or price fixing role. Okay, let's call it price fixing because I agree with Subrata. There's a lot of pollution that happens there and farmers don't really have the freedom to discover the price and so on and so forth. Right. And I really, in the absence of a minimum support price, which works very well in Punjab and Haryana, the farmers would be at sea, right? But they do. So APMCs as a system do aggregation and price discovery fairly efficiently. They are done by small traders, right? And in this time, they have become the most important physical, logistical, and financial hubs in the agri-supply chain, especially for grains, right? They aggregate the supply very efficiently. Now, if buyers want to buy from farmers and bypass the APMCRs, they have to set up the physical infrastructure and manage the logistics to do so. So, it's not so easy like, the companies that I've worked with in the past, huge corporations, right? So even for companies like them to go into the marketplace, into rural India and set up these APMC yards, it's going to take a lot of investment, more in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of people, effort, bandwidth, and so on. Okay, it's not going to be very easy to do. This takes time, this takes money. So what I suspect is businesses and buyers, corporate buyers may well end up doing the smart thing by co-opting the APMC setup into their supply chain. So I have an option of going and setting up a supply, a non-APMC private mandi in some location, let's say Louisiana or wherever, Amritsar or wherever. But if I can bring the cost down by 80 or 70% by simply going to the APMC mandi and say, telling the Arthiyas there, look, why don't we do business together? You procure for me, and then nothing changes, right? Really, that's a possibility. I'm not saying it'll happen. So then the APMC traders and the APMC ecosystem will continue to be the key intermediaries. And of course, the change scenario is that the oversight by the ultimate buyers, which will be the corporates or the bigger agribusiness players, on whose behalf this trading is happening, there'll be some quality parameters. The overall produce quality will improve. The consumers will benefit as a result of that. All that will happen. But how this quote unquote freedom to the farmers to sell where they want to outside the APMC stranglehold, how does it play out to the benefit of the Indian farmer remains to be seen. Okay. For example, in Bihar, the APMC Act was abolished, I think, in about 14 or 15 years ago, and farmers should have benefited significantly. However, data shows that this has not happened, right? It's not that the Bihar farmers are significantly better off, or even significantly, maybe marginally worse off than they were before. And the reason that has happened is an alternative ecosystem to replace the APMCs has not been set up even after 15 years in Bihar. Now, if that had been set up, the farmers would have been in a different place. Abolishing APMC restrictions, great in theory, also great in practice, in my personal opinion, but it's not so black and white as it's being made out to be. Some of the concerns that farmers have, and Deepak, this is to your point earlier in your introduction when you said, we need to look at the nuances of these laws, and this is the nuance. It's not as if if I was a small farmer, my concerns would have been. And the reason for that is there is a certain level of comfort and familiarity I have with the existing ecosystem of going to a known trader, going to a known Arthia, going to a known APMC and selling. I might be happy, unhappy, etc. But typically what happens is the cash rotation is faster. There's a certain level of certainty. And with this, if the prices go up or down, that's something that I've learned to live with as a small farmer over a period of time. Now I've got to go out and if the market doesn't find a way to my farm gate, then I have to go out and find a market on my own. The more enterprising farmers will do that and profit, but by definition, most farmers will not have the capability to do that. So they'll have logistic costs, they'll have transportation costs. So how are they going to handle that? So this will take some time to pay out. And most importantly, for this to deliver the benefits across the agri ecosystem, and most importantly to the small and marginal farmers and medium farmers, state governments will have to play an active role in being the sort of midwifing this entire process of shifting the ecosystem, encouraging businesses to come and set up procurement hubs, encouraging in the case of horticulture produce, encouraging cold chains to be set up, creating an environment, enabling environment, policy changes. So unless the government, so for instance, what happened in Bihar, the act was abolished, but the government didn't step in to fill the vacuum. That enabling environment in the case of agriculture, the government has a role to play, not by procuring by itself, but by enabling private players to do so, either through changes in regulations or enabling the setting up of infrastructure and so on. It'll take time to evolve, but absent a concerted effort by private sector and state governments to make this transition happen, it's going to take a long time, and there are chances it may not even happen. Similarly, on the Essential Commodities Act, Subrata is absolutely right. I think I like one point that he made, which is that India is considered to be a very unreliable exporter. Why? Because of the whims and fancies of government, export bans are imposed and they're removed. And import bans. So if I do, I've been in situations where I've done a trade for pulses, importing pulses from East Africa into India in my corporate life, and suddenly, boom, stock limit has been imposed, or imports have been banned, or when I want to do an export of chana from Madhya Pradesh into East Africa, boom, there's an export ban. So what do? Right? If I want to process pulses as a corporate a person in India, then I've got a stock limit. I can't have, I think Maharashtra had about 700 metric tons of stock at a given point of time. Anything more than that, I can't stock. Otherwise, I'm breaking the law. So the Essential Commodities Act has been abolished, but the government has said that they still maintain the right in the case of exigencies, and they've not defined those exigencies. The central government has the right to reimpose stock limits, reimpose price controls, etc. No, whenever there is a political hot potato that happens, and the consumer in the street starts shouting about the price of onions or shouting about the price of tomatoes, immediately there'll be some kind of stock limit, some kind of or the price of pulses go up too high, then there'll be a stock limit imposed, some tweaking in the minimum support price, and so on and so forth. So the Essential Commodities Act being abolished, it will be actually good, and it will have a very quick and positive impact on the agri economy in India, provided the government takes away the power from itself to reimpose all those restrictions on a case-by-case basis, if they so desire. In that case, what's the difference? So there's a risk of that happening. But if they were to then say that we will not do that, then I think at least from an export perspective and a macroeconomic perspective, India will be seen as a reliable exporter. And there'll be millions of farmers who will benefit in certain grain crops at least in getting onto the export bandwagon, realizing a better price for their produce. Because very often the minimum support price in India, tends to be politically, it's a cost plus pricing, and agriculture in India is inefficient, so cost tends to be higher and so on. And contract farming, of course, is open and shut. Some states allow contract farming already, and there's really nothing that I think farmers should be worried about that, because I think the only problem with contract farming is that the title to farmers' lands is very iffy. So if you don't have a solid title, then there is a legitimate concern among the farmers that the land might be taken away from them. So that is a problem of land titling and land rights and so on. So that has to be tackled separately. So that, Deepak, is my sum and substance in how the farmers are going to be impacted. I think they're going to be impacted positively, but two caveats here. First caveat is it will take time to work for these changes to work themselves through the agri-economic system. Second, unless the governments in the state and the center actively come forward to enable this transition, then I think a lot of the gains will not happen.
In fact, Shyam, you bring in along with this one very important point. This is that people are used to a certain system, and therefore they are operating in a comfort zone. I don't have to go anywhere. So that enterprise is very important, that is required. Yes. And if I know whatever little I know about this industry, I think one of the challenges that the industry is facing, that the farmer's son's aspiration is not to become a more technology driven, sophisticated farmer. He is looking at a non-agricultural profession as pursued. Do you both agree to this? And if so, what could be the impact of this phenomenon on this entire industry, given that the new laws, as Shyam, you said, needs enterprise if you really want to succeed on behalf of the farmers? Of course, as you also mentioned, the state government needs to agree and sort of support the entire ecosystem. So what are your take on this in terms of the business angle of these laws? Subrata, Shyam, whoever wants to go first.
So can I take this first? Please, I mean, I've got some immediate experience on this, so I could sort of talk about it. Look, the Indian farmer, let's understand, is a businessman, right? I look at all the people who say, oh, farmer is an Annadata, all this kind of stuff has happened in the last 1 month. He is God, he is Annadata, he should be worshipped. All these things are paying lip service to him. At the end of the day, you pray to him as an Annadata and do nothing to improve his lot in life. Who are we kidding? Let's be honest about it. So I look at the farmer as a businessman, a small-scale businessman, who needs help, definitely, but he's enterprising. Look, at the end of the day, what does he have? He has nothing. He has his land, he has whatever agricultural knowledge he has a little bit of capital at his disposal, and he tries to make a living out of it. Do it, sell it at a certain price and sell it wherever he can, whatever price he can get. A lot of them survive. Most farmers do, manage to survive, but see, let's also understand a lot of the farmers also survive on non-agricultural income, right? Somebody in the family goes, for instance, my driver in Mumbai, his family farms in Madhya Pradesh, just outside Bhopal. He's a driver in Bombay, he sends money home. And he would go home during Kharif harvesting season for 1 month, and he would help his family harvest the land. So his family is not just dependent. So he is a driver, his brother is doing something else in Bhopal, and one more brother and his father are, tilling the land in Bhopal, some 5 acres of land that they have. Otherwise, they can't survive. But they're very enterprising, right? They live in hope, they work hard. And forget about even the Punjab and Haryana farmers, the way they've taken to technology in terms of mechanization, in terms of the knowledge of agriculture, it's quite astonishing. It's not you have to respect them for that. It's a different matter. They've got used to a certain way of life and they don't want to give up that, and why should they? That's what the fight is about. So they are eager to accept technology. But there's one point that needs to be made. Yes, a lot of them look at farming as a last resort, okay? And they don't want the next generation to go into farming. Now, that is because they know that the value addition in farming is much less, and the income is much less. Why should they? It's very hard work. It's drudgery at the end of the day. It doesn't really give them much. They do farming. Most farmers do farming out of necessity, not for anything else, right? For very few of them is it a vocation of choice. And those typically tend to be the farmers who own 30, 40, 50 acres of land and can be productive with it. They're open to using technology, but they're not open to paying for it. That's been my experience. And, because they don't have, for two reasons, Deepak. One is that they got used to getting a lot of stuff free electricity, free water, free this, free that, subsidized fertilizers. I think this has been harmful to Indian agriculture in the long run, but they're willing to accept technology. They don't want to pay for it. They're in a risky profession, but at the end of the day. And my fundamental belief is that, if you talk to some people, they say, oh my God, no, we have to get farmers back into farming. I'm saying, no, we don't want farmers to come back into farming. We want farmers to leave farming so that land sizes can increase. Today, a farmer is farming 1 hectare, 2.5, 3 acres, 4 acres, 5 acres of land. It's not economically viable. But if suddenly 50 million farmers move into manufacturing or services, then you have the same arable land, 50 million farmers less. The farm size can double. It becomes more economically viable for them. But to your last question, I don't think that there is a direct correlation between what the farm laws will do and the question that you've asked. These two are separate issues. But if the overall profitability of farming increases in the medium term, in the short term, nothing will change. I'm convinced about that. In the medium to long term, if it happens, then I think it's good because the quality of of our agricultural produce will also go up. And I know we have a question lined up against that later on.
All right. Subrata, your take on business?
I would also like to bring a little bit of research and kind of a cross-country experience in this very interesting area. See, one of the things that are happening across the emerging economy, that how do you really take a subsistence farmer to a commercial farm? What Shyam is mentioning, that how can you look at agriculture as a business? And then at the end of the day, it's a business. But the challenge is, today, Indian agriculture, the farmer, we don't really look at him as a business person, as he was mentioning. And that's the change. That's the problem. I'll tell you a small example. There was an FAO data which shows that all the investment made by smallholder farmers in the world is 3 times more than all the investment made in agriculture. So if you go by this data, smallholder farmer is the largest investor in agriculture. But where is that recognition? Number one. Number two, because they don't look at it, all are not looking at it as a business. That's why the entire risk mitigation proposition is completely skewed. See, any business we do, we all talked about how to mitigate the risk. But when it comes to Indian agriculture, mitigation of risk is somebody else's business. And that's why you bring a lot of subsidies and other things. Now, see, this becomes a kind of a vicious cycle. Now, yes, where you need subsidy, that's another interesting issue. And if you look into the WTO discourses, where you need the subsidy. Now, today, primarily our subsidies are misplaced. Again, I'm making this comment, it cannot be really too general because there are areas where you have to make, these subsidies for water, electricity and all, but it cannot be a blanket one for everybody, everywhere kind of. Now I was looking into some of the data in the Punjab. It's a very interesting case. Now look at Punjab. Now Punjab, because of this advantage of subsidies in, electricity is free, water is almost free, and India is almost free. The Punjab actually gone into completely grain bowl kind of situation. They are only into paddy and wheat and paddy. Now, because of that, the entire agro ecosystem is gone completely wrong. Now, today, probably in Punjab, instead of MSP, probably it's a provocative thought, they should need, incentive to grow alternative less agri crops. Now, obviously, you have to provide support to do that. I mean, traditionally, if you look in the entire Indus Valley, this is the place where pulses being grown. If you look into the, even in the histories of Harappa and Mohenjo-daros and all, the grain they got, good grain is actually pulses. So this is traditional area of growing pulses. Now probably you have to reintroduce that one and bring that. So this is one I think we need a policy much more focused to this kind of thing. Second issue is what Sham also mentioned. I do really agree that yes, agriculture needs less people because even in by economic terms, our factor productivity is very low because many people into agriculture. See, there is no problem of having many people in agriculture. The problem is there are very little meaningful, occupations happening in agriculture. We had a study long time ago where we have seen, particularly in a marginal ecosystem, a farmer generally do 3 to 4 types of jobs. Only one of these is agriculture. Other is all non-agriculture. It's
Yes,
exactly what
that's right.
Sam was mentioned. So a farmer, cannot survive just doing farming. So he's good. Now, what is the flip side of it? Because he is actually, kind of a hedging his, risk, he is actually not putting everything into the farming. It comes to the use of technology and the whole question, particularly in Indian context, is the quality of produce. See, our quality of produce is actually an area which needs a lot of attention. See, if you look at by sheer number, we are the largest producer in so many crops. But when it comes to productivity and quality, we are not even close to one. Many years ago, I was interacting with Unilever and they made a very interesting comment. They are telling that, look, India is the largest producer of tomatoes, but we produce 30% of our tomato puree from China. The reason is the quality of tomatoes in India is not, suitable for our product. So the point is, this is an area I think, need to do. Now, in this particular context, that I would really also like to bring in one area, which is again a little bit of provocative. Look at this today's current, protest going on. All the optics what we are looking at, these are old farmers. Average age of Indian farmers is 50 plus. I mean, actually 53 plus. Average age of African farmers is around almost 60. Now tell me, how do you really experiment? How do you really bring in these kind of challenges with people already hardened? Again, please don't misunderstand me. So agriculture needs young blood. Agriculture is now. Look at these, even in agriculture, not only in India, in the emerging economy, there is a clear deficit of talent. Now, how many of us, take our case, uh, we are fairly, intelligent or not say fairly studious. We all opted for engineering or medicine or something. We didn't go to agriculture. But if you go to Netherlands, if you go to some part of the Europe, the best brains, even in Australia, best brains opted for agriculture. These are the things also needs to be looked into. Like even today, and what is that change happening? Is the technology making this change? Yes, they still don't have a critical numbers, but if you look at modern agriculture, if you look at, agri-tech and all, the people who are coming now in India, they are all actually people who are not traditionally from a farming background. So people are actually looking at agriculture as an option. Yes, still they are, apparent things, and we need to really increase the critical number. So these are the kind of larger issues Indian agriculture needs to address. Now, I just wanted to, made a comment and then I stopped. I mean, we do a lot of work in Africa. So in one of these, exercise in Africa, so the current president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, he himself a very renowned scientist, and he was the agriculture minister in Nigeria. So he made a very interesting comment. The issue is that why young people are not coming to, agriculture. So he told, look, agriculture is not sexy. And exactly what Sam is mentioned. Agriculture is synonymous to drudgery. Agriculture is synonymous to, I mean, you look at a typical farmer. He has a torn, soiled clothes, and barefoot. And, so that is the picture of agriculture we are pushing. But whereas, I mean, so these things needs to be changed. And as Sam mentioned, it's not going to change overnight. But if these laws are being followed properly, then it will probably create some kind of new opportunity.
Okay,
now it's up to us to
Subrata,
raise it.
can I just interrupt both of you at this stage? See, one very important dimension that you have brought about is this quality of produce. Correct? We may produce a lot, but the quality of produce is something which leaves lots to be desired. I have 2, 3 questions in this regard to both of you. First, if the farmer has a freedom to sell what he produces anywhere that he wants to, My little understanding is it will impact his quality of produce. Point number one. Point number two, both of you have seen a lot of agriculture related work industry, both from a seeds perspective, pesticides perspective, and variety of perspectives. What type of an impact have you seen of technology on farming and quality and productivity of land? And the third question I have is specifically to Shyam. I know, Shyam, you have been mentoring a lot of this tech companies, agri-tech companies. I think all of us would like to know one or two interesting areas where you think there is a lot of development which could actually help the entire revolution in agriculture, if I may say, for our country.
Great. So, I'll just take the last question first because I think, that's an area which is quite interesting. Now, what's been happening over the last maybe 10, 12, 13, 14, maybe 10 to 15 years is that there's been a gradual increase in the number of startups in the agriculture space. For instance, I work as a senior advisor with an impact investing firm called Willgrow. It's a foundation, and so we ran a process to source companies in the agri space for a couple of mandates that we're running, and we got about 300, maybe totally 400 applications in the span of about a month and a half. And then we winnowed down and we had to select a few, and then we sort of took them through the investment process and so on. There's a lot of activity there, and a lot of these startups that are hired, and 400 is only a microcosm. There's probably more than 1,000 agri startups working in this space. Some of them are more well known. You heard of SkyMed, which was a startup many years ago. There's Ninja Cart. So there is AgroStar and so on. So a lot of these guys have actually become relatively big and well known. They've been getting private equity investment and so on. Now, given the fact that the Indian agricultural ecosystem is so disaggregated and fragmented, technology diffusion is also fragmented. So it's not so easy to scale technology in India as it is in, let's say, Latin America or the US, or even lesser so in Europe as well. Because their farm size is large. So you take a technology to one farmer in the US, on an average, he has 300 acres. So the technology is adopted on 300 acres. If you want to go get the same 300 acres of adoption in India, you've got to go to 100 farmers. 100 farmers who are not that literate, who may not like digital technology, who may not trust it, because there are various reasons. So technology diffusion and a large scale, the last time this happened was with the Green Revolution, where it was done by the government. They set up dozens of agricultural universities all over the country. They set up the irrigation infrastructure, they built dams, they dug canals. Green Revolution happened. High yield varieties of rice and wheat were introduced to farmers. So a lot of this, that is also technology. Farm mechanization happened. That's also technology. It's not digital technology, but technology at that time that was actually midwifed by the government. That's why it took off on such a large scale. But nowadays, technology interventions are being mostly midwifed by the private sector, and digital technology especially is being midwifed by the startups. So one example of a startup that's working in this space is that there's this company that it's called Cultivate, and that's we work with, which has got a sensor that is stick in the ground. It measures the moisture level in the soil and gives an automated triggers an automated advisory in terms of the crop soil combination, in terms of when the irrigation should be put. And they've got the capability of actually connecting, through an IoT process, Internet of Things process. They'll connect the sensor with the pump switch. They can do that. Okay, they've got a control group. They've got a LoRa system. They can. So when the sensor reads that a particular field needs to be irrigated, it actually has the capability of triggering a signal to the switch of the pump, and the pump can start irrigating the field. And when the sensor sees that the moisture level in the field has reached an appropriate level, it sends a signal to the pump to switch it off, right? And so, for instance, we've done some studies with paddy crop in Punjab, and you can actually reduce the water level, water irrigation across the season by half almost. So that's an enormous amount of saving of water, saving of electricity. And if you irrigate crops, if you give water to crops only when they need it and don't over or under irrigate it, the yield actually goes up and the quality of the crop will go up. So we're still figuring out the data from that trials to see how much the yield increase will be and so on. But interesting technology. So you have a sensor. It's all Indian Atmanirbhar Bharat. It's developed in-house in India. So this sensor has been developed by a company based out of Bangalore. You stick it in the soil. It's got an IoT capability. You can choose to use the IoT capability or not choose to use. So it's up to the farmer. And there's a huge benefit in terms of electricity saving, in terms of diesel saving, in terms of water. And as you assume, just imagine 10 million farmers across Punjab use this. Can you imagine the impact it will have on the groundwater levels in Punjab? It's incredible. It's incredible. Now the problem is, for this small startup to go and approach 10 million paddy farmers in India, it's not going to happen.
Correct. So
But
the
there are many
fragmentation
stories
of the
like this.
industry is becoming a big challenge.
Oh yeah, but the exciting technology being done here, there is another thing that gives agri advisory based on drone service, hyperspectral imagery, fly a drone over the farmer's field once every 2 weeks, reading the chlorophyll content in the leaves. It's able to figure out and predict, okay, from 3 days from now, you're going to have this attack of a particular pest. So go and spray this particular, chemical and stuff like that.
Question, Shyam, I would interrupt and ask you and Subroto is, do you think this type of technological advancements would be catalyzed if at least the new laws to some extent is accepted and implemented? Would that?
I think before taking it to the new law, I think I would also like to bring one particular dimension into this.
Sure.
See, if you look at agri-tech or whatever Sam was mentioning, it's still on the supply side. The demand side actually the users, and we are telling that because it is fragmented, because it is all true. But if you look at the smallholder farmers, I'm not talking about only just India, but in across emerging economy. And I would also mention one of our work in this regard, that it is important to really understand the demand side perspective. That if there is a demand, and definitely these both end will meet. Yes, if there is a policy, if there is a enabling situations, it will facilitate and accelerate the process. Now, one of the greatest challenges, even today, we as a behavioral economists try to really tackle that. How do you understand the demand perspective? Why you see all the things what Sam has mentioned, it's only going to do good to you as a farmer. Then why you are not doing it? Why are you taking an irrational decision, not doing that? Yes, there are certain extent of knowing that one is an issue, but today I think knowing what is happening and send that information across to any consumer is not a big deal. You can always do. I know millions of farmers today also use Facebook. I know millions of farmers are also doing some kind of social media space and all these kind of things. But that does not necessarily mean they will choose this. We did the research project with the Australian government, and what we found that there are certain particular behavior attributes that actually facilitates a farmer to choose a particular technology.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so what we found, the farmers were having a strong ability to do experimentation. Farmers having strong ability to apply acquired knowledge, they will be your first level of customer. And as soon as you identify these people, then it's a kind of an induction effect. And in traditionally also in agricultural extension, people are doing it. They call lead farmers and this and that. So now if you can apply that level of scientific approach to identify. Now the question is, if a customer is actually using that, how it works. So we work with a company. It's a very large company, works one of the largest liquor companies. Now they come up to us and tell, hey, we are into contract farming. We want to reach out 1.5 million farmers across Africa. But we really don't want to go and pick anyone. So you help us to identify first 50,000 farmers who are really, really aspiring for new technology. Now, so their point is that these 50,000 farmers will help us to reach out the rest 1 million farmers. So the point what I'm trying to make, these are the things now also have to do. Now, question is, as you are telling, is this current laws and all? To my knowledge, not directly, but definitely these kind of laws will create an atmosphere or ambience for competition, ambience for new things to do, and then they will obviously look for it. And again, it will be. Second issue is what I mean, that how the law actually create that. See, what is the quality what we are talking about? Another huge opportunity India is having is actually minimizing waste. See, our post-harvest loss is around 40%. What are we talking about? So, but these opportunities, these things will probably bring in more innovation into that space, to do this one. But again, so answer to your question that not everything will be directly, kind of a correlated to this law. But when you really opens up system, opens up market, value competition, then hopefully things will come because, based on my whatever experience I have, I can tell you one thing: India is land of talents. India is the land of doing things in a way. See, we might when I jokingly tell jugaad and all, but if you look at the Indian engineering, particularly the people who try to find out a solution in Indian context, is is fabulous. Nowhere in the world we have seen this kind of things. So I'm personally quite hopeful that yes, more competition will come in and more farmer will adopt this kind of technology, but not all farmers will do it. So there has to be a process, a mechanism to identify these right guys to start.
So, Subrat and Shyam, do you think entire this supply chain that we are talking of in this industry, would there be a lot of opportunity there in terms of employment, new business, if some of these new things are implemented?
I can give one example into this. I mean, it might be contextual. See, today people are talking about middlemen, it is adatiyas and all. No? We had actually did a project. It started as a project and then it became a program now in Indonesia, where we were actually helping this middleman to increase his efficiency. Now, what we found, these middlemen, many of them, they are very low on use of technology. Their working capital is a big issue. I mean, they are not big guys, they are small guys, small, medium guys, they also, so what we have done in this, we actually try to see that how they can add value to the produce they be collecting from the farmer. So primary processing, packaging, storage, and all this. So when that investment comes in, this guy is actually making a win-win for both the parties. So I fully agree with Sam. What Sam was telling that, look, when these laws are coming, that does not mean all the Aratiyas will go off the, they will all go unemployed. No. Many of them will actually innovate and many of them will take the advantage of this new law as well. I mean, they probably will come up and, so probably it may so happen. I'll be very happy. All the technology solutions that Sam is telling, maybe these group of Aratiyas will be the first franchisee. Maybe they will be the conduit to really take it to the next level, because what they have currently, they have the database of the farmers. They actually know each and everybody they work with. That is their capability. They might not use, tab or computer like us, but they actually know everyone by name. They actually know what is the family background and all. So I think this is a huge resources they are working on. So probably this new freedom will make some kind of win-win situation for all of them.
Shyam, your thoughts?
Yeah, on what specifically?
Businesses, logistics, the supply chain of this agricultural district. Do you think it will have more opportunities if some of these new things come in?
So there's an opportunity. See, I'll tell you what, definitely what the entire supply chain of ag from the farm to the fork is very disaggregated today. You go to a mandi, from mandi it goes to some other sub mandi, from there it goes somewhere. So 3-4 people, 5 people involved before it reaches the farm. Your and my kitchen. And each link in the value chain, the supply chain, will obviously keep their own margin.
Right.
But there's margin leakage, but there's no increase in efficiency. It's too fragmented. It's not the way to work. So the Indian agricultural ecosystem as it exists today is an enemy of scale. And because it's an enemy of scale,
I like that.
It's an enemy of efficiency, right? This needs to be broken. Now, what these laws try to do, if I look at it from a 30,000-foot view, what these laws try to do is to create an aggregation in a disaggregated Indian agricultural economy. That's broadly one sentence to aggregation of supply chains, aggregation of value chains, contract farming is that. So starting with aggregation of land, which could lead to efficiencies of production, efficiencies of factory use, and so on and so forth. Aggregation of evacuation of produce and at the farm gate, and then leading on to that, aggregation of supply chains all the way up to the kitchen or the consumer's kitchen. It's possible, right? So it is trying to drive efficiency and scale into the entire Indian agri economy. These three laws are trying to do that by unshackling it in various ways. That's one broad way of looking at it. From when I look at it that way, it makes eminent sense to me.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So when you look at it in that perspective, then these laws, if they come together and they work very well, which I'm sure they will over a period of time, very confident about that, it will create opportunities to streamline the logistics and supply chain downstream also. There's no question about it, right? So if you've got I think corporatize is the wrong word to use for that, but if you've got a systematic supply chain that procures efficiently from the farmer, aggregates the supplies and takes them quickly without passing. Each time produce changes hands, it loses a bit of quality and adds a bit of unnecessary price, right? So the lower the number of touch points that you have, the better it is. And I think if you aggregate it in this way, and if you've got businesses that are built, which are oriented, if their entire business is managing the supply chain from farm to the kitchen table, I have no doubt that these laws are going to be beneficial. In fact, not only that, Deepak, I'll come back to my original statement, which is saying that these laws are driving efficiency and scale and aggregation in a disaggregated Indian economy. Logistics is but one part of that. It will impact technology adoption positively. It will impact access to finance of the farmers positively. It will impact risk mitigation of the farmers positively. It is enormously beneficial, but it will take time for it to play out. And in the interim, there is likely to be a lot of pain also for the farmers.
Yes.
In fact, and if I add whatever you said, Shyam, to that wastage 40% or something which Subrata said, the customer is likely to benefit in terms of the price that he will finally pay for the produce that he uses in the kitchen.
Theoretically, yes.
Sorry, Shyam?
I said theoretically, yes.
Okay. One last question before I open up the questions which have been posted. This entire thing about MSP. I mean, I want both of you to throw a little bit of light about this. MSP, what is it? What does it do? Brother, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So MSP is, I mean, this is a very interesting initiative, which was needed long time ago. The whole idea of MSP rooted is that, particularly for the food grain, it is government prerogative to really stop, so that any possible famine or any possible shortage can be taken care of. So that's why you decide a price and do that. Now, if you look at, and now see that the state who has actually benefited out of it is actually Punjab and Haryana. Now, Punjab and Haryana, they have actually used this MSP so effectively. Now, the data shows that other than Punjab and Haryana, only 6% of the farmers are actually getting benefit out of it in the whole country.
Which data is this? What source of data is this?
This is a study done by government agencies. I think it was done by the Planning Commission data.
Okay. All right. So it's the government data.
This is the government data. It is government data, and they're telling the only now. I think the base also from the National Samples are there. So NSSO has the collected data, and then from there. Now the point what is that MSP now? So any this kind of arrangement actually creeps in some kind of what Shyam was mentioning, inefficiency. Now because the MSP is there, so if you look at today in Punjab, the farmers are actually managing because of MSP. Just because of MSP. But now, and it is very skewed. Till few years ago, it was only grain, but now there are many other things have included it. But the point I was taking in the beginning, see, that doesn't necessarily encourage a farmer to take other crops. See, only just telling that I have a minimum support price for, say, pulses, that does not necessarily, encourage a farmer to take pulses. There are other issues involved in it.
So yeah, in fact, Subrata, I know from experience that very often farmers have, there have been seasons where most farmers in, let's say, Maharashtra and MP have sold their pulses below the MSP because MSP, there's no procurement.
Exactly. So if you take, and from a global perspective, then again, if you look at many a times, some of the crops, our MSP price is even more than the international price. So how are you going to compete? So these are the kind of areas if you look into. Now, MSP has another connotation which we must not overlook. That is that MSP is primarily an instrument government used to procure. Now, definitely government, because we in India, we run two large welfare schemes. One is called PDS, Public Distribution System. Another one is National Food Security Act, by which you actually make grain available, to the millions of poor people. So government will continue use MSP to procure all these, but it cannot be the only one to do. Because if you look at the challenge today in FCI, because there are because of MSP, so much of produce there. I was reading an article a couple of days ago. In the grain we have, we can actually feed the entire world. So all this needs to be now. As soon as you open up and you have a choice to go somewhere, then obviously you are creating in some, building in some amount of efficiency. So I think MSP has to be looked into that way. MSP, another is that MSP is also very political issue. So no government will get away with MSP. MSP will always remain there. But as soon as you open up, other firms and other open market comes in, the farmer have a much better choice to really go and switch over to other crops that can also.
Shyam, your point of view on this before we take the first question?
No, I would agree with Subrata. See, MSP, the only place where MSP has worked and worked well for the farmers' advantage has been Punjab, Haryana over the last 30, 40 years. He's right. 94% of MSP beneficiaries have been in rice and wheat in Punjab. By the way, not many people know that rice and wheat are not the only crops covered by MSP. There are 22 commodities, including rice and wheat, which means there are 20 other commodities nobody knows about. Pulses is one of them.
Right.
And pulses are not grown in Punjab. And in large states where pulses are grown, mostly it's almost hit and miss. Some days, in some years, they're able to sell higher than MSP, then they come to the private market. And if the private market is lower than MSP, they go to the government, but the government is not procuring. So pulses tends to be a very risky business, and then also, the Essential Commodities Act, import, export bans, and so on and so forth. So that's a different matter. Now, see, I'll tell you what, I think agriculture has to be diversified. And I know there are millions of farmers in India who grow horticultural crops, but actually doing very well. So they're able to ship out their produce and they're able to get a good price for it. They make reasonable amount of profit, so on and so forth. So MSP is I don't think that having an MSP leads to any great benefit for the farmers. It all depends on whether the government is able to procure whatever the farmer produces at that price, in which case the government will be really under financial stress. It doesn't happen. And so, in theory, if an MSP is cost plus pricing and every farmer's produce is purchased, then farmer's very happy. But then where is the incentive for him to become more efficient with this farm? I don't really know if it works. From a macroeconomic perspective, it makes no sense.
Exactly.
It's only a social thing that, I'm trying to protect and give a safety net to the farmer. But the safety net is so tattered and so limited. Punjab, Haryana, beyond that, there's nothing. And there's something in sugarcane also because of the way the sugarcane industry works. Otherwise, it's not really.
So let's take the first questions. The question has been asked by Mr. Arjun Basu. I think we've answered it partially, but anyway, let me put it across. What would you say is the inefficiency in the supply chain in India today on an average, from what the farmer gets to what we pay while purchasing from the vendor?
Okay. So I think the inefficiency is quite large. Now, I don't know how to quantify it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let us take the example of milk. Okay, milk is one of the first, most successful, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of the second question that Arjun has asked, which is what percentage of the end consumer price goes to the farmer. In the case of milk, let's say Amul milk, right? If I'm buying Amul milk, a pouch of 1 liter Amul milk at 42 rupees or 43 rupees, 44 rupees a liter, I think it's how much, for a particular brand that I buy in Bombay, it's 48 rupees a liter. And the farmer in Gujarat gets about 30 or 32 rupees a liter for it. He's getting 60, anywhere between, depending on how much of fat content in the SNF he has, he gets anywhere between 60 and 70% of the end consumer price is what the farmer gets, which is fantastic, right? And look at the supply chain. Amul sets up milk collection centers in literally hundreds of villages across wherever they operate, thousands of villages across Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and wherever they operate. They bring it to a chilling center where the milk is chilled, pasteurized, packed. So they might be having local chilling centers or bulk coolers, and the bulk coolers to chilling centers, but it's one company handling the entire supply chain. It doesn't pass through too many hands. And they also make a decent margin on top of it. and they sell it. So 60 to 70% of the end consumer price the farmer gets, because the supply chain from the farmer's gate, from where the milk is collected to the house is not too long. So the company collects it from the chilling center. It can go to a bulk cooler. From the bulk cooler, after cooling, it is shipped out to a processing plant. Processing plant, it gets packed and gets dispatched in vans to the cities. That's it. Versus mandi, rice and wheat in Punjab, it goes to the APMC. From the APMC or from the mandis, it gets procured. It goes to an FCI. Go down, and from there, and if you look at horticulture, for instance, very disaggregated. So farmer brings his tomatoes to the mandi. Some guy buys it in the mandi in a sack, and then from let's say in case of onions from the Lasalgaon mandi, it goes to some other mandi. From there, again, it changes hands, and by the time it reaches Delhi, it will pass through 3 or 4 different hands, loading, unloading, and all kinds of damages that happen in the way. So if milk is I'm just using this as an example to illustrate this point. If the value chain from the farmer is more efficient, then the greater percentage of the value goes to the farmer. There's less wastage in the system, right?
Right.
Whereas if take the case of tomatoes and onions and fresh produce, when the fluctuations in price, sometimes tomatoes you get at 30 rupees a kilo in the hand cart outside your house, sometimes it's 80 rupees a kilo. We've all experienced that. But when the price goes from 30 to 80, the farmer's income can go only from, let us say, 10 to 15 or 10 rupees or 20 rupees a kilo. Most of the value actually goes to the middleman, and you as a consumer are paying a very high price. So if you're paying 80 rupees, the farmer gets 20 rupees, which is 25%, 30%. So that essentially is where it's at. So to answer this question, yes, I'm working with, I'm looking at a startup right now which buys directly from the farmer and sells it to an end consumer. The farmer gets 60% of the value of horticulture, which is unheard of. It's very high. That's because it's one entity doing an efficient supply chain. So that answers his question, that if you have more efficient supply chain, more of the value goes to the farmer. All the inefficiencies that are there in the supply chain benefit the farmer. The consumer maybe not so much, but the farmer definitely benefits.
Correct.
I just wanted to add here one thing, technology plays a major role here. Technology plays a major role here. In fact, hello.
Yeah, Shyam, you're there. Shubhra, please continue.
Yeah. So technology plays a major role here. See, milk is a very interesting case, but if you take it to other vegetables or all, it's very complex. Each vegetables are different. Each horticulture produce are different. So the storage, processing and everything, it makes up, more complex. So technology plays a major role here. I just wanted to add here, we know a company who actually, harvest, they collect the harvest from the farmers based on the market they are going to sell it. So the ripening, of that particular banana is actually determined by the distance it will, it will traverse, So that's the way they also factor in the prices. So the farmer, that these are the things, as soon as it comes in, then only farmer gets a really good price for that. So that needs to be looked into as well.
Okay, Rajneesh Gogia has the question: how will the new laws change the game of contract farming?
Yeah, maybe Shubhra, you can take that.
Yeah, I think the contract farming, as Sam mentioned, that this is already there. Some states are doing, some states are not doing. What this law will actually help to develop a proper comprehensive SOP. A proper comprehensive SOP was missing. That will definitely, this law will provide that framework. Now, so and again, the success of the contract farming also depends on the choice of that particular company. That what are the things you are going to produce through contract farming, that will determine the entire game. And this law has put a legal framework, and that will help that arbitration can take place. But this is an area the concern is genuine. I think government needs to really think more on in terms of how this arbitration process will be more easier. And I think that amendment is already coming in the place. What I have heard from this discussion going on between the Farmers Union and the government, that this is that already been taken care of, that okay, that arbitration procedure has to be more comprehensive. So that will really make these things, more easier for participating farmers.
Okay, there is one more question Shlok has asked. Shlok Jaswal: how are agri-tech startups approaching the problem of farm fragmentation in building up demand or supply sides of their business? Shyam, would you like to take that one?
It's a great question, and I think that's a question which honestly it's a difficult one to address. So the honest answer to this question is that there is no startup that is currently addressing this on a large scale, right? That's the question, right?
Yeah,
Is it
right.
anybody addressing it on a large scale? So the answer is no. But let me tell you a nuance. There are a lot of startups who are actually, see, there's no doubt about the fact that the farmer needs help on his uh, sell side. When he has to sell his produce, he needs, he'll be very happy to gain access to a higher paying set of customers than he has access to today. And agri-techs are trying to sort of bridge this gap in some way, digital startups. So one of the startups that I'm evaluating from a perspective of giving them some investment is they buy directly from about 20 odd farmers in and around a particular metro in India, and they bring it to their warehouse and they grade it and sort it. And simultaneously, they take orders from they've got a pool of about 1100, 1200 households in that metro who have been onboarded with this brand. They take orders from them and create baskets and buy directly from the farmer and sell. So there is just this person who buys from the farmer, grades, sorts, and gives it to consumer. There is no other middleman. There is no thelawala. There is no vegetable man. There is nothing. 60% of the value that the customer pays the company goes to the farmer. Okay, the farmers are demonstrated. Now, if these guys are going to expand from 200 farmers to 2,000 farmers, okay, that'll take the startup at least a couple of years to do. Okay, they need funding. They need to have patience. But the problem, Deepak, is we have millions of farmers in India. And you've got startups doing this all over the country. Every startup has got a small footprint. Okay, there's another startup that is working with farmers to give them agronomic advisory to improve the quality of their moong dal and their cumin crop, right? So they run drones on top of these fields and they give advisory, etc. At the end of the season, they get a better yield. And these guys are interested. There's these guys saying, okay, they're telling the farmer, we'll pick up your cumin, we'll pick up your moong dal, and we'll sell it. So they are trying to talk to companies like Dabur and a couple of other companies which are in this trade. So they'll take a truckload of moong, they'll do a deal, sell it, they'll make their margin, give the money to the farmer. Now, again, it's very small, millions of acres of land. These people are working with 5,000 acres, 10,000 acres. For this startup to go from 10,000 acres to 1 million acres, it's not going to happen. So the whole startup ecosystem is disaggregated. Lovely ideas being done, technology being used as a platform to connect farmers with the market. But scaling is going to be a challenge in this area. Which is where I'm saying when these new laws come and they aggregate a disaggregated agri ecosystem, even these startups can have scale. Today, there is no national database that's available, which these people can. So if there's an India stack that's being built up, right? There is a health stack that the government of India wants to build up. There is talk about an agri stack. If an agri stack happens and a unified database like an Aadhaar is created for the agri system, which will take years to do, but it's worth doing, then it will take off.
Right. One question from my side to both of you. For a moment, let's hope that some things will change in the industry. How much, which form, etc., is not the purview of this discussion. I personally feel that if things improve for the better, whichever way it is, organizations which are in this industry, agri industry, their quality of manpower, do you think they need to sort of improve the skills and abilities of such people? And your thoughts on this, both of you?
Manpower means you are talking about the people in the industry.
Yes.
Agri industry, the entire industry, people who are not farmers, but companies who are involved in this. Because of these changes, do you think that their quality of manpower, their abilities of manpower needs to be sort of rebooted?
Yeah, obviously. I think it's obviously because see, if you look at the procurement guy, for example, just talk about a procurement guy on behalf of a company does all the procurement. Okay, say he is procuring wheat for a biscuit company, for example. Okay. Today he has a lot of choices, so he has to be more enterprising, and in terms of getting the right, product at right prices, and that's the interesting area to do. And it's not easy, but obviously these kind of human resources will be very valuable to that kind of companies to do, because today he has no choice. He just go to a mandi and pick it up. But tomorrow he will have a choice to experiment with maybe a group of farmers to do, or maybe to work with some of the companies who are into this space. So obviously, that will definitely, help to do that. But I think moreover, another interesting area is that even besides the human resources, many of these companies will also diversify. They say, for example, traditionally, I being again a biscuit company, for example, my job is to just to procure, a wheat and the wheat. But today, I probably would look for developing a new market for me or a new niche area for me where I can go, work with 10,000 wheat farmers. And then technology can come in a big way to help them. So these are the new things we'll definitely, I mean, this is happening in other parts of the world. So I don't see there is no problem to happen that also in India. But I mean, Sam might have a specific example.
Sam, your thoughts. You have worked extensively in India on this industry.
You're talking about, you want my opinion? And,
Yes,
Deepak?
yes, yes.
Okay.
On
No,
manpower.
I think it requires a couple of things which need to change. One is obviously in a changing environment where the way of doing business is going to change, hopefully for the better. You need entrepreneurial ability. There's no question about that in my mind, because you have to be able to take advantage of new opportunities that are created. So you need an entrepreneurial ability. Second thing is you need agility, right? Absent, because what will happen is you'll have to experiment. Certain things will work. This is agriculture. Things will go wrong. Contracts will not be honored. Some bad day. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So you've got to have the agility to be able to quickly move. What in India we call jugadu. That kind of mentality is extremely important to have, right? And all the other skills in the agri industry that are currently there in terms of being able to read risk, manage risk, hedging, managing working capital, all those will be required, continue to be required. But agility, entrepreneurship, and imagination. You need the imagination and the innovativeness to be able to craft new structures in a new environment, in a brave new world, if I can call it. What kind of structures will work? How do you develop a platform that will integrate various aspects of a moving value chain? So agility, entrepreneurship, and imagination. These three should be added on top of the skill sets that are already there for people to prosper in the agri industry.
All right. Subroto, Shyam, your concluding remarks for today. What are the key takeaways that you want people to take with them? Shyam, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I think, as I said, the three laws are in principle steps in the right direction. I think when I look at the three of them together, they are significant first steps in the direction of aggregating and systemizing a disaggregated and relatively disorganized agri economy in India. Point number two, this will take a fair amount of time to work through the agricultural system in India before the results start to be seen. There will be ups and downs. There will be winners, there will be losers. And some of the farmers' concerns are, I think, fair from that perspective, and they need to be mitigated. Three, for these laws to actually bear fruit, state and central governments will have to create an enabling environment so that the new infrastructure and ecosystem is put into place to take the place of the one that it seeks to supplant. And four, it can also open this aggregation can open the floodgates for a whole lot of tech-based innovation to take place. Startups can rush in, companies can rush in, but that will be the last step, provided the first three conditions are met. And I think then the future would look good.
Subroto, your thoughts?
The first thing is that this law will probably give kind of an opportunity to look at India with a definitely new way, particularly from an export point of view. Now people will probably look at us more seriously, kind of, yes. Second is that this law will probably pave that, foundation to, India becoming kind of a really, really, superpower in terms of food and agriculture, because we had enough opportunities to really encash. Third, I would really like to tell that, some of the instrument has been used in other sectors that can now come into agriculture. Like one of the greatest example is the DBT, the direct benefit transfer. And so all these things, redefining the subsidy program, redefining the incentive will actually make things happen. Just law per se might not create a lot more opportunity, but these are the things needs to be done kind of thing. And then the last, not the least, is that it was long overdue. It will create a kind of a sense of competition, sense of Indian agriculture. It's now up to all of us to really encash that, not just the farmers, also the consumers.
Thank you, Subroto and Shyam. And if I could gather from whatever both of you discussed, is the laws per se mean nothing unless this can be implemented the way it will benefit the country. There is a lot of, nothing is black and white. There are some areas which are gray. The intent, action, and everything has to sort of come together. The governments have to work in a lot of collaboration in terms of enabling the change. And as we all know about change, no change comes without any pain. And that could be and will be the case in this. However, we do not know what will happen finally. Overall, I think we believe that it could take our country, the industry to the next level, which could benefit everybody who's involved in the industry. It will benefit the country, it will benefit the customer. And I think at the end of the day, we will take some major steps towards becoming that global superpower that we are on the way to. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope your time has been well spent. We will be having a monthly discussion like this on different topics which are sort of pertinent for that point of time. Our recording of this will be available on YouTube, and we will be actually also doing some amount of transcribing of this talk, and it will be available to you on our website. Thank you for joining us. Happy Pongal belated. Happy Lohri belated, and that was the context why we thought we'll do it today. And all the best for the journey ahead. Let 2021 be a much better year than 2020, which I'm sure it will be. Thank you. Thank you, Subrata. Thank you, Shyam. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, Subrata.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.